Climate change has a new poster
Climate change has a new poster boy.
boy. Companies from British Airways to
Companies from British Airways to
Facebook and pop artists like Billie Eilish and Massive Attack
and pop artists like Billie Eilish and Massive Attack
have promised to make changes to bring
their greenhouse gas emission closer to net zero.
their greenhouse gas emissions closer to net zero. They're joining a club of more than 50 countries around the
They're joining a club of more than 50 countries around the
world. This race to zero is a vital step towards managing climate change.
This race to zero is a vital step towards managing climate change.
But what does net zero really mean?
But what does net zero really mean?
And is achieving it even possible?
And is achieving it even possible?
Net zero has gone
Net zero has gone
viral. But like all simple slogans, the reality of achieving it is far more complicated. Humans burning fossil fuels has resulted in more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is warming the planet. To stop the warming, the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has to stop
The level of greenhouse gases in atmosphere had to stop rising.
The obvious way to do that is to stop emitting.
Them.
But that's easier said than done. For some industries such as aviation and manufacturing, eliminating emissions is really hard. In the years leading up to the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2000,
in 2009,
scientists realized something. It wasn't possible to cut emissions fast and thoroughly enough.
It wasn't possible to cut emissions fast and thoroughly enough
to meet the temperature targets that policymakers want. What was needed was to actively remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Too. People began to talk about a world in which greenhouse gas emissions and greenhouse gas removals balanced each other out.
And greenhouse gas removals balance each other out.
So that the overall effect was net zero. The countries that signed up to the Paris Agreement pledged to turn this idea into reality by agreeing to balance their emissions and removal of greenhouse gases in the second half of the century.
To achieve net zero emissions, we need to do two things.
To achieve net zero emissions, we need to do two things.
One, which is more obvious, is to cut our output of greenhouse gas emissions. From things like burning fossil fuels. But the other is actually to take emissions out of the air.
but the other is actually to take emissions out of the air.
And that's the harder and sometimes more obscure
And that's the harder and sometimes more obscure aspect
aspect of getting to net zero.
of getting to net zero.
This is known as negative emissions,
This is known as negative emissions,
and the scale on which they might be required
and the scale in which they might be required
is one reason that net zero targets will be hard to
is one reason that net zero targets will be hard to achieve.
achieve.
We'll need to go from a world economy that
We need to go from a world economy that pumps out on the other
pumps out on the order of 40 billion tons of CO2 a year
of 40 billion tons of CO2 a year to one that sucks down
to one that sucks down, that is, removes billions of tons per year in the
that removes billions of tons per year in the future
future to get to that net zero
to get to that net zero future.
future. There's different ways to do this. Forests do this naturally
There's different ways to do this. Forests do this naturally
through biological processes or sinks.
through biological processes or sink.
But what we're really looking at now
But what we're really looking at now
to achieve ambitious climate targets are man-made approach. Really looking at now to achieve ambitious
to achieve ambitious climate targets a man-made approach.
climate targets are man-made approaches.
Some methods for removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere are already being used at scale, such as the planting of new
Already being used at scale, such as planting of new forests
forests and improving soil so it can store more
and improving soil so it can store more
carbon. But there are new technologies at a much earlier stage of
But there are new technologies that much earlier state of
development. Among them, ways of capturing carbon dioxide
among them ways of capturing the carbon dioxide
and storing it underground.
and storing it underground.
Carbon dioxide could be pulled directly from the air by machines
Carbon dioxide could be pulled directly from the air by machines
or by growing plants,
or by growing plants,
burning them to generate electricity,
burning them to generate electricity,
and then capturing the carbon dioxide as they
and then capturing the carbon dioxide as they burn.
There's a flurry of innovation in negative emissions technology.
There's a flurry of innovation in negative emissions technologies,
A range of ambitious to wacky, and none of them are proven at scale.
a range of ambitious to wacky, and none of them are proven at scale.
And that's what makes them so problematic.
And that's what makes them so problematic.
The world is counting on
The world is counting on innovations
innovations that have not yet been demonstrated at
that have not yet been demonstrated at
scale to achieve targets that we're setting for ourselves.
to achieve targets that we are setting for ourselves.
And that's a big question mark.
And that's a big question mark.
We're hopeful, but it is still a risky
We're hopeful, but it is still a risky bet.
bet.
how much greenhouse gas needs to be removed
How much greenhouse gases needs to be removed
from the atmosphere
from the atmosphere
will depend on how much emissions can be cut.
will depend on how much emissions can be cut.
The conundrum. That is,
The conundrum, that's the Greenwich part.
we need both massive reductions
Massive reductions in emissions,
as well as a dramatic scale-up and
as well as a dramatic scale-up in proving
proving of the technologies for negative emissions.
of the technologies for negative emissions.
There is a tension between the two,
There is a tension between the two,
and it's easy for governments and industries to there is a tension between the two, and it's
and it's easy for governments and industry
easy for governments and industries to kick the can down the road,
to kick the can down the road, saying,
saying, well, let's